plague and did it on opium, and wrote about rambling through London. His approach was then followed on by that great Welshman Arthur Machen, who wrote The Art of Wandering, which was again another book about going out largely at night and ambling through London to no purpose and writing down what he experienced. In Paris, the poet Baudelaire was described as a flaneur. He was wandering for no purpose through old Paris before Paris was rebuilt, when it still had the arcades, before the boulevards went in. And Baudelaire reported back that what he felt in a great city was a sense of alienation. And he felt the alienation because he couldn't talk to everybody he bumped into. So he ended up talking to no one. Now, if you're in St. David's and you're walking down the street, you talk to everyone. If you cross a field and you see someone on the other side, you shout across to them. If you do that in the city, people think you're mad. Baudelaire wrote about the alienation and turned this into a psychogeographic act. Now, it's probably a truism that if you record the speed at which people walk down the street in London, then record the speed at which people walk down the street in, should we say, Oxford, it's slower in Oxford than it was in London. And then it's slower again by the time you get to Cardiff. It's slower still by the time you get to Swansea. When you reach Haverfordwest or Solva or St. David's, you're virtually crawling. And that's not just suggestion, that's the way it is. The pace of life slows as you move. And discovering that and making something from it is a psychogeographic act. There were a group of political activists, cultural political activists, called the Situationists in Paris in the 1950s, led by a guy called Guy Debord. They grew out of a lettrist movement that was mainly consisted of sound poets, but they wanted to do artistic things that had some cultural import. And they invented a thing called the dérivé. Let me read you the definition of a dérivé. Where one or more persons during a certain period drop their usual motives for movement and action, their relations, their work and leisure activities, and let themselves be drawn by the attractions of the terrain and the encounters they find there. But the dérivé includes both this letting go and its necessary contradiction, the domination of psychogeographical variations by the knowledge and calculation of their possibilities. What they did was they went out for boring days. They would go somewhere at utter random and just spend the morning there, getting what they could out of it, making what they could out of it. And if you roll this process forward, you end up with psychogeography.
So when you set about writing your first book on Cardiff, I mean, were you deliberately setting out to produce a work of psychogeography?
No, I didn't know when I started working on that what psychogeography was. I was driven by the editor of Planet magazine, John Barney, contacting me and saying, this is around about 1999, 2000, that he could see that there were a lot of changes going on in the capital of Wales, and would I like to go out and write a piece about it? Well, if the changes that were going on in Cardiff could be seen from Aberystwyth, and I, as a native Cardiffian, weren't really aware of them, something must be happening. So I did what John asked. And I then evolved the idea that I could add bits of information to this on a website, which I set up. And I kept writing slivers of information, collecting data, interviewing people, getting experiences, and linking it all together on a clickable website, and rolled the whole thing into something that became the very first real Cardiff book and spawned the whole concept of real writing. In real writing, you make your own headway in the sense that if something isn't there, you don't invent it, but you create it. I'll give you an example. In the second Cardiff book, I wanted to write about the tall buildings in Cardiff. The city didn't have a policy. on what it should do with its tall buildings. It was in competition with Swansea for the building of the highest tower in the whole of Wales. Swansea won that, beating the Capital Tower, which is where we got first in the capital. But I think Swansea's been beaten since, and we've taken the title back. But anyway, in order to follow this research, I wanted to go to the top of these towers. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, because you immediately encounter Jobsworths the moment you enter the foyer of any tall building. Even St. John's Church, which I wanted to go up to get the medieval version of what a tall building would be like. So what I decided to do with my architect friend was to go around and declare that this was Tall Building Day. So the two of us would turn up in the foyer and say, good morning, we're from the architectural, and then you'd mumble something. And as it's Tall Building Day, we wonder if we could possibly look from the top of your tower. Well, they were always delighted. And up we went. Never a one tall building did we not get to the top of, including St. John's Church. Tall Building Day didn't exist, but nevertheless, the results of it are in one of my books.
From what you were saying a moment ago, the notion of psychogeography is attached very much to urban landscapes. You know, Defoe, London, you mentioned Paris and so on. It doesn't seem to kind of necessarily fit very, very happily with the kind of Welsh sensibility, because, you know, Welsh culture is not primarily an urban culture, is it? It maybe it's becoming that, but cities are latecomers to the Welsh experience.
Yeah, we don't have cities, or we'd never had cities originally. Not in the sense that Scotland had Edinburgh, or Ireland had Dublin, or England had Cambridge and Oxford, and London itself, of course. London, founded by the Romans, the greatest city and largest city in the world, with the most history to it and the most depth to it, echoed in Edinburgh, echoed in Cambridge and Oxford. By the time you got to Wales, you had bugger all, in effect. We didn't do big cities. We didn't do very big towns for a long time. Merthyr, at 60,000 population, was the largest conurbation in the entire country. Which means that the traditional way of looking at something psychogeographically and delving into its past, trying to find out what's underneath where you walk, couldn't be applied. So I had to try and think of ways of varying this. Could I expand it somehow to make it work in a less urban environment? I reckon we've come off with this. When I was working with Nigel Jenkins, who was writing Real Swansea, he wrote Real Swansea, and he wrote Real Swansea 2, 2 volumes. He asked me, well, what do we do with these real books? At the time, we were looking for a Neolithic pathway that Nigel was convinced was there. Now, the Neolithic pathway was constructed of pieces of wood that were laid down across a damp area, and they led from the beach at Mumbles directly out to sea. Now, the tide was out for us, luckily, so Nigel and I walked out to sea with him kicking at rocks, looking for this pathway, which we didn't find, but he assured me was there. And when I later got home and looked at the GPS on my phone, which is a device I use all the time in these psychogeographic adventures, there was just a line heading straight out to sea, as if the pair of us had just walked off the edge of the world and vanished completely. But Nigel wanted some sort of explanation for what he should be doing, and this is what I came up with. We discuss the process of writing these books, quarter the city, take in the outlying districts, work out the connections, make the place as big as you can, walk the patch, delve and ask questions, read the histories, meet the people, dive deep into your own memories, and where those are lost or non-existent, latch on to others who are still in touch. Meet the famous and the local. Ask them to show you the parts with which you are less familiar. Uncover what you can of local mystery and find out why it is and what it is and how it is that it's here and what will happen next. Walk everywhere, never drive. Use your bike when appropriate. Take the bus and the train. Make notes, make more notes, make more notes. Write it down, then up. Fashion the many fragments you now have into a satisfying and much larger psychogeographic whole. A thing worth reading. That's how to make a real book. And Nigel, of course, became a master.
Well, of course, I mean, Nigel of beloved memory. I mean, he wrote Real Gower. I mean, shortly before he died. I mean, you took it over and produced the final text. But I mean, Gower obviously is largely rural. I mean, how does that compare with his Real Swansea, would you say? And what is the psychogeographical difference?
The Swansea had more detail. It had more historical depth because there was more literary history to delve into. There were more people on the streets. There were more streets to write about. Gower became a more reflective book, allowing Nigel to be more inside his head than outside it. I think that's the basic difference between the two. I think Gower is a logical extension of the Real Swanseas, and if you read them in sequence, Swansea 1, Swansea 2, Gower, it flows and you can see exactly how Nigel has constructed these. You can also see running in parallel to that his experiences as editor of the Encyclopedia of Wales, building up great towers of knowledge that he uses readily and pulls into Real Swansea and later into Real Gower, and the methods of research and construction of the encyclopedia. You can see that experience benefiting his writing.
I try to get hold of Real Swansea 1. It's out of print, so you can get it, you know, on Amazon, but it'll cost you about 400 quid.
Yes, keep saying this because the publishers need to look, well, they are looking at filling the gaps in the series. There's something like 25 books in the Real series now. And to fill in the ones that have gone out of print, there are some famous ones that have gone out of print. Mario Bassini's Real Merthyr, for example. But as fast as they go out of print, new ones arrive. There's at least 4 or 5 books in the offing now. Real Cambridge, written by Graham Davis, is out within the next fortnight. Real Oxford by Patrick McGuinness follows quickly on the tail of that. Rhys Mwyn has written Real Gwynedd, which will be out at the end of the year. There's a Real Hay-on Wye finished. And in process, there's a Real Bristol. So that's 5 books that are all going to come out within the next 12 months. So it clearly works as a concept.
Yeah, absolutely does. I mean, but it's interesting, you know, you've gone beyond the border. I mean, you've gone into England and also into Scotland. I mean, how do the Real books outside Wales compare with those that have been written inside Wales, would you say?
Well, the introductions are different because I write the introductions to all of them. And the ones that are inside Wales, of course, have my kind of a, how can you put this? It's me, it belongs to me because I come from here, flavor to it. Whereas the ones outside are always, as a visitor, by definition, because they can never be the places that you are. I don't think ultimately this matters. I think that if you can get to know a place, I mean, you yourself have written a real book. You've written a book about Preseli, but that's not where you were born. That's not where you were brought up. And I think it's perfectly valid to take a place into your bones, as it were. And then come out with the book that represents it.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of brought up in Preseli. I mean, part of my family from there, been there since I was a small child. But, you know, when I was writing it, I wasn't conscious of writing a psychogeographical tract. It didn't even occur to me. I mean, I remember you complaining, you know, when I had it in various drafts. You said to me at one point, John, you've got too many people. You've got too many people. You have to cut out the people. I said, I can't do that. I'm a journalist. That's what I write about, people. So was I writing a psychogeographical book, or was I writing, what was I writing?
Well, you were writing journalism at the time you had too many people in. By the time you'd extracted them and you followed a few other principles, the famous one that I said to you in the construction of real Preseli was, John, you are best when you go off and walk on your own, when you go off onto the path and you write down the experiences, what you find, what seeps into you at that point.
So the essence of it really is how the author reacts in a personal way to the experiences that are unfolding in front of him.
That's one of it. Yeah, that's part of it. That's part of it. But the other part of it, of course, is that the devices that you use in writing a real book are to follow lost rivers, to look for railways which aren't there. In fact, things that are no longer there are the great principle of, it's the great principle of psychogeography. I went on a tour given by John Pickles, Dr. John Pickles, on the work of Raymond Williams. And we went to look at the site of a signal box that appeared in his novel, Raymond Williams's novel, Border Country. Mm. And of course, we were shown a field in which there was nothing, because there used to be a railway, but there wasn't a railway now, and there never was a signal box. It was all in Raymond Williams's memory. So we were a crowd of people standing there with John Pickles talking to us and about an imaginary signal box, which had been written about in a novel, which didn't exist, but did appear in the author of that novel's memory.
There was a signal box.
It wasn't where we were standing.
There was a signal box because...
But the point of that is that we were celebrating this bunch of people in this empty field, the nothing. We were celebrating something that wasn't there. And that's an essence of psychogeography as well. You allow what used to be to come up through.
Yeah. Well, you're obviously in the wrong place, because I've got a photograph of Raymond Williams standing in front of the signal box.
Oh, there was a signal box, but it was not where we were with John.
Right. And his father, of course, did work in the signal box.
Indeed so.
Yeah. This is the second time that Raymond Williams has come up, actually, in the course of the day. He was quoted by Mairead Hopwood earlier on, to great effect. Anyway, so the real series, they are the essence of what you consider to be psychogeography.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. It doesn't say psychogeography on them, although that's what they are. That's what they've become to know. I've learned that if you define something, particularly if you're working in the cultural sector, if you're working in art, if you make a definition for something, you corral it and you cause it to limit its powers. It's always good to push the boundary and to flow around and over whatever definitions you've set up for yourself. And that's a principle that I've always followed with the real books.
Well, you've written one in the real series that is quite different, it seems to me, in category from the others, because it's not about a city or a town or a particular region or an area like Preseli, or it's about a country, Wales. You've done real Wales.
That's right.
How does that work in the pattern of the real books?
Well,
and how is it different?
Well, a few things. I mean, I started to try and imagine Wales in the future as the country that J.G. Ballard would have written about. J.G. Ballard's countries had conurbation from beginning to end. You got on the train and the train went right round the world and you met yourself coming back and you were still in the conurbation. And I thought, can I deal with Wales in that way? And anyway, what is Wales? Now, that's a question that David Melding in the previous session was asking in terms of, he was referring in terms, what is Wales in terms of this state or this nation or this nation state? He didn't like nation state. He wanted us to be either one or the other. But what is it? How to define it? So I came up with, in fact, perhaps I can read you this. This is out of real Wales. So what is this place? Grey crags and a green miasma in the western British mists. A place like poetry where nothing happens. a place of sheep and hairy men. Where is this land? Most of the world does not know. And if they do know, they can rarely point us out. Wales, I never heard of that place. Wales, the invisible, the lost. Wales, the real Cancer Gwaelod, a small rock in the Hebrides, a rock off the coast of Ireland, a hummock out there in the stormy ocean. Wales, Grassholm writ large, just that little bit larger. A floating land full of birds. Defining Wales is like defining verse. For every rule someone comes up with, there will be an exception which breaks it. Ultimately, poems become what they are because the poet says so. Wales is like this. The bit you think of as real probably is. The feathers in Llanystumdwy, the greyhound on High Street in Newport, Barafundle, the power station at Connors Quay, Splot, the Millennium Coastal Park at Llanelli, the Spar at Flint, the writers gathered at the Vulcan in Adamsdown, the street of subscribers to Taliesin magazine in Preseli, the coach spotters at Swansea bus station, Brecon Cathedral, the cairn at the far end of Golden Road, the Urdd Welsh classics for adults, the sewage works in Aberystwyth, the place up near Dovey Junction where there's no platform, but the trains still stop, the left bank of the River Lug near Bleddfa, the Codfather of Soul chip shop on Barry Island seafront, the place where David Ellis Thomas used to park his car near the Senedd, the steps of the National Museum and the pillars behind which John Tripp once hid his bicycle clips, the jetty at Mostyn from where the Airbus wings once set sail, the bridge over the lost Roath Branch on Penellan Hill, all as real as each other.
That's tremendous. You know, we all have our, well, I don't know, I say all. I mean, our generation anyway, the generation that came, you know, to a, you know, in the 60s and 70s, that's when we landed, as it were. We kind of set out to discover Wales, didn't we? In a way that was, I felt, looking back, or I feel looking back, it was kind of new. This sense of having a feeling for the whole country. But were we just eccentric? I mean, no normal person had that kind of perspective, did they?
Well, we had the audacity to think no one had been here before and imagined this place as one, and we were the first, which we weren't. But doing that thing at that time was new. And you're right, there was an element that before that, Wales was a different sort of place. Again, a comment from one of the earlier sessions when somebody suggested that early on in the devolution debate, some of the voters at Swansea said, we don't want you to bring that Welsh stuff down here, we're English. And you had a lot of that in Wales, very near the surface, a lot of people who openly were resentful of things Welsh and who, if they had English roots, they weren't quiet about telling you that. And everything rolled along like this, and there were elements of it right the way through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. The key moment was the Millennium Concert, which coincided with the devolution vote, which was held in the Oval Basin in Cardiff Bay. And Shirley Bassey, who was previously massively opposed to anything Welsh, appeared on stage wearing the Ddraig as a dress. And that was the moment when everything changed.
And that dress now resides in the National Museum in St Fagans. Yeah, someone ought to interview her about that, really. I've often felt that, I mean, I don't know quite why, but in my life, I've always had a supreme desire to identify with Wales as an entity. But I felt I've been swimming against some treacly tide in trying to undertake this. It does seem that when Welsh people think about who they are and so on, you know, they don't identify with Wales, but they identify with somewhere very specific inside Wales, within Wales, their borough or their town or their village. I mean, is that a particular or unusual or a particularity of the Welsh people? I mean, or do you think, or is it, what does that tell us about who we are?
That's the Milltir Sgwâr notion, which I came upon when I decided as a much younger person than I am now, that really what I ought to do is to look into the culture of our country correctly, and to do that you needed a little bit more of the language than I had at the time. And I came across this phrase, Milltir Sgwâr, Vro, the district, your personal patch, Milltir Sgwâr, your square mile. And the phrase came up again during the lockdown that we've been suffering, when it was impossible to get out and do half the things, or 99% of the things that I would generally like to do. And I got commissioned, as a number of other writers did, by Robert Minhinnick at Sustainable Wales, who was working on a project to do with the green future. That was one side of it. But the other side of it was your personal area, your Milltir Sgwâr. How local could you go in what you wrote? And that set me running, this idea, could I get out there and could I write about something in the same psychogeographic manner, but something that was extremely small, extremely close to me. Let me read this. I'll take a few minutes to read this little section from a thing that I came up with, which I called the holy power of Pen-y-Lan. On these early maps, up where Eastern Avenue rolls through along its deep cutting, was Pen-y-Lan Well, a holy well, a spring of ancient power with a history that goes back, folklore tells us, to the birth of Christ and before. The shape of our Lord's knee is pressed in the well's rim. There were Easter fairs held here around the well to celebrate its unearthly powers. Oxen were spit roasted, drunk and dances had, the raves of their day. You could get the well and its holy water to act for you if you made the appropriate offering, a bent pin and thrown in. Your sacrifice, a strip of your clothing torn and tied to a nearby bush. If it was a disease you wished cured, then the illness would seep from your body in time to the colour bleaching out from the cloth strip, the one you tied to the bush under the South Wales sun. These pagan pre-Christian wells were commonplace right across the land. Some still stand, but most are forgotten, the powers they had ignored. When Christianity arrived, rather than face down the older religions, it merely took them over. Work for Christ, not against him. Around Pen-y-Lan Well, hymns were sung. Delve into the folklore and you'll find tales of veneration, but also stories of ghosts, men on horses, women in dark dresses, wailing and moaning in the darkness, trapped here by love lost, by ancient wrongs, by things which can never be put right. When I went hunting for this bubbling source of holy power, I laid maps across each other, ancient and modern, and found the precise location, the northwestern corner of the Jewish Old People's Home and the burgeoning Pen-y-Lan House. The trail of exuded water from the spring had been let into the drains, allowed to seep through the earth. I followed the course of its gully south, running through the back gardens of Bromwith houses before disappearing in the direction of the Nant y Lleucu, the Roath Brook, running alongside Roath Recreation Ground. I told a neighbour that the back of his garden seeped holy water. Things grew powerfully there. He told me he'd put it to good use. I've no idea if he has. So it's the same principles of exploration, but a tiny area that really, if I looked out of the window of the house here, I could probably chuck a tennis ball and it would land on where Penland Well used to be.
Mm. Mm.
So I'm trying to make it small. How small can you get it? I'm going to do the back garden next week. Can I do it with
I remember a lot of people watching won't remember, but a man called Gwyn Morgan. He was a Labour politician. He's from Aberdare, and he was a very bright guy. But in the late 60s, he was the Deputy General Secretary of the Labour Party. And in the early 70s, he went for, when the job became vacant, he went for the general secretaryship. But his problem was he was regarded, I suppose, as being on the right of the Labour Party. He was also very pro-European. And he didn't get the job on the casting vote of Tony Benn. And then after that, he joined Roy Jenkins in Roy Jenkins's sort of pro-European saga, and Gwyn went to Brussels and became Roy Jenkins' chef de cabinet. But he came back to Wales as the first European community representative in Wales. Anyway, cut a long story short, I remember him telling me once in the 70s how he stayed in Stratford-on-Avon at a boarding house or a B&B or something like that. And the fellow who was running the place was Welsh. And he clocked, obviously, that Gwyn was Welsh. He said, "Where are you from, man?" And Gwyn said, "Aberdare." And the man said, "Don't generalize." Where, Llwyd, Aberabad, and so on and so on. Anyway, the particularity of our Welsh sensibility is very powerful, isn't it? And
this runs in the place names, where we have very specific place names for lots of things. It seems to me more of them on the old OS maps per square mile than you get on the English equivalents. The further west you go, the denser this naming of places becomes, and this naming of things that is descriptive of the landscape over which we're crossing. And these names, which I look up and I track every time I travel somewhere, of course, are vanishing at an extremely fast rate. They're vanishing either because they are simply forgotten. This often happens, that they are not used because there's no purpose to them anymore, that the bend in the river that they described isn't there because the river's been put into a pipe, something like that. Or they've been deliberately changed from Welsh into English because the Welsh name was not saleable, whereas the English name is. Now in Llanedern, Llanedin, you'd say if you were a Cardiffian, just up the way here. They're building massive new houses, but they're not calling them that. They're calling them Buttercup Field, because you can say that and they can sell the houses.
Well, I think the Senate is going to pass a law quite soon.
Yes, we hope so.
Requiring that Welsh names be sustained and all that kind of thing, which I think is obviously a good thing. Maybe I was thinking about this the other day. Maybe I'm a bit wrong in thinking that we've never had a sense of Wales as a whole to imagine, because if you look back, I mean, if you go back to the early rise of Methodism in the 18th century, I mean, you had preachers, going on horseback the length and breadth of Wales, proselytizing and so on. And I remember the late Phil Williams saying to me, Phil Williams, who was a leader of Plaid Cymru for many, many decades, great guy. He was an astrophysicist as well as being a politician. He's probably an astrophysicist first, really. He was, famous for discovering the hole in the ozone layer in the South Pole and so on, that kind of thing. But anyway, he said, Wales was most united in the age of the railways, when you could, when Wales was connected by a patchwork quilt of railways, and preachers could get on a train in any town in Wales and get off in any town in Wales, whether it was north or south, east or west.
That's something in that.
But we've never been as connected since, he used to say.
But it's a myth that people did not travel across Wales and didn't pull it together. There's any number of books written by travelers who got on pack horses and found ways of zigzagging across the country. The landscape of Wales in the 18th century was thought of as terrible, absolutely awful. Nobody admired mountains. They hated this jumble of rocks and felt threatened by them. It's only later on that these came to be regarded as beautiful. And that kept a number of people out who didn't want to encounter those things. But if you roll these into psychogeography, if you roll all of these concepts into the book that you've written about Preseli, you end up with the great Martian spaceships of the standing stones, do you not? Now, let me ask you, you're the authority on Preseli. Has your position changed since the discovery that Stonehenge is now a genuine Welsh article and in fact used to stand here?
Well, I mean, not really. I mean, you're talking about the
bluestones.
The bluestones that came from the Preseli Hills and somehow washed up on Salisbury Plain in that area. And the question is how they got there. I mean, there's never been any argument that they did originate.
Yes, but the latest research shows it's worse than that they actually stood in a circle for 500 years in Preseli before being put on sledges or whatever they were put on and taken south.
Yeah, well, that is, but it's not. You know, they say that the hole in the ground is the same shape as the stone that now is standing in Stonehenge, and the shape of the ground in the Preseli Hills. I don't know. I mean, it's not 100%. I mean, I remain to be convinced how they physically managed to manhandle these stones across 150 miles. You know, I mean,
no, I think what we've come into here is the point of division between the true psychogeographer, myself, and the doubter, yourself, because I believe in the standing stones levitating at night and spinning above us, and that great forces out there are coordinated by such things, and that the stones that you see lying along beyond Golden Road, along the ridgeline of Preseli, are actually King Arthur and his knights frozen into the ground, waiting to reappear. And I can believe this in a funny sort of way. And that elevates my spirit. Whereas you want a little more precision, I fear.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, I mean, the argument made by the well-known geographer Brian John, who's written a lot about this, is that, and others too, is that the Preseli stones were actually in the Ice Age were dragged up by glaciers and movement, and these glaciers moved as far south as the southern coast of England, and then they retreated. And as they retreated, the debris that they contained, all the stones just sort of fell, and as the glaciers melted, and were left, you know, and they were picked up by the people of that time. I mean, that has always seemed to me to be a more rational, logical explanation than the idea that you know, these people who, I don't know, did they? I mean, apparently they are supposed to have built sledges and lashed these large stones weighing more than a ton or whatever it was. And then, but what people fail to remember is that, you know, you didn't have roads or anything in those days. You know, you had a load of undergrowth and forests that actually kind of crashed.
This is true, but you see, the opposition to that is where we actually are. We are all, technologically speaking right now, virtually speaking, I should say, we are all in St. David's. And St. David's is at the focal point of any number of lines of force and lines of belief, ley lines, old ones and new ones, which come across the country, and they cross at the cathedral, they cross at the standing stones, they cross at the cromlechs, and they pour out over St David's Head. The whole of that part of Pembrokeshire is a centre for belief, a centre for salvation, a centre for redemption. It's all of these things rolled into one. And things can happen, I believe, in this part of the world that are not going to happen anywhere else.
It is true what you say about St David's. There's something. It's why indeed we have founded the Festival of Ideas, because to us St David's is the centre of the world. You know, it's all a matter of perspective, isn't it? I mean,
we were talking about that earlier on, or somebody was talking about that earlier on, about how, no, it was Mairead Hopwood, that was right.
Yeah.
Where she said that, was it her mother had said that she'd gone to London, and she said, London's so far from everything.
Well, yes, she was. It was about a parishioner from some chapel in Pembrokeshire had followed her son to London and was asked what it was like, and she said, "Oh, you know, it's very nice, but it's a long way from anywhere, isn't it?"
There are more examples of standing history in the landscape in Pembrokeshire than there are progressively as you move east. So in other words, as you move west through Wales, the density of remains from the past increases. And there are an awful lot of such things lying around the place in Pembrokeshire. And you compare that with, say, Vale of Glamorgan or Gwent, where ancient remains are much, much sparser. We're talking about stuff from before the Romans, largely here. Yeah,
well, I mean, one of the, I've been visiting Preseli since I was a boy. I've had a long research, but when I was doing the book, I found out a huge amount about it that I had never appreciated or hadn't known. Yeah. I mean, if you think of the standing stones, and the origin of Pen y Fan, classically, but the others, St Samson, there's a whole range of them, and their origin, and there's a fascinating new theory about why they were placed where they were placed, and why and the theory is, the idea is that they were not, as conventionally understood, sort of burial chambers, but they were. Why is it, if they were burial chambers, are they built as they are? Huge capstones, with the underside sculpted very, very expertly, and the upside, and they're standing on very, very narrow, pointed stones, and the idea is that and I go into this in the book, but the idea is that they were part of the people of the time representing a creation myth, that they were somehow a life emerging from the earth and rising to the sky. And so they were stones that were being lifted effortlessly up to the sky. Well, and they're kind of a mythological idea of the creation, and so on, which is a very different idea to there being burial chambers. It's reverse. They're about life and emergence, and all of that. And that struck me as fascinating notion.
I agree completely. I think it's no coincidence that White Sands Bay was from where St Patrick left forcibly, I understand, for Ireland. That these routes and these places all cluster together in St David's.
And it's known as the Golden Road, isn't it, to Ireland?
It's the Golden Road,
to the Wicklow Hills, where they mine the gold. And so on.
Yeah.
So I think in this new era, we're going to have to, post-Brexit, as we struggle to regain our sense of balance as a country, Wales. That's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to reach out to Ireland and forge a new relationship, new connections.
Yeah.
And I hope, in future iterations of our Festival of Ideas, that we will make a very special point of reaching out to people across the Irish Sea and strengthening that link and getting, because the Irish are great enhancers of life and living. And when we can meet again in the hostelries of St. David's and have that whole experience, which we've missed this last year, haven't we?
I agree. Yeah.
We can do so with our hands across the Irish Sea.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a great note, if I may say so, to bring our discussion, which I've enjoyed very much. And I'd like to thank you, actually, Peter, for the huge contribution you've made through your books or through your poetry, but through your real series, which you edited. They brought a whole new dimension, I think, to not just the way we see our own places, our particular places in Wales, but our country, Wales, but also our connections, you know, with the rest of the British Isles. Are we going to see a real Dublin before long? I don't know.
Well, we've done a real Glasgow. We have to look that direction next time.
Yeah, indeed. Okay.
So.
Well, I'm going to hand over now and be joined, I hope, if the technology works, by Eluned Morgan, who's going to wrap up this inaugural Festival of Ideas. We've all been virtually, some of us are actually there, but if we're not actually physically there, we're there in spirit, in St. David's. And over to you, Eluned.
Well, diolch yn fawr. That was just such a fascinating discussion. I could have listened to you all night. It was wonderful. And I know that the comments on the chat reflect that as well. Maybe, I hope next year, when we're doing this in real life, we could do a little psychogeography in St. David's. Maybe we could do a little walks around. I've been trying to locate the St. David's Well, which is near Porthclais, for a long time, and I can't find it. So if anybody can help me with that, that would be wonderful. But I think there's real opportunities for us to be exploring St. David's together and doing some of this psychogeography. Perhaps, Peter, you'd be willing to just talk us through how we do it and do it in a real life.
This is eminently possible. Yeah.
Wonderful experience, right? That's the first thing, John, for next year. So thank you so much for teaching us so much about psychogeography. Really interesting, and I'm sure that people will be inspired now to really look at their own areas in a different way, taking into account some of the suggestions that you've made. Now, it's my job to bring this festival to an end, and I'd just like to start by thanking really the inspiring leadership of the people who've brought everything together, and John is certainly one of those. And thank you so much, John, along with Patrick Nash, Amanda Stone, and of course Ivor. Just thank you so much for all of the effort that you've made. I know it hasn't been easy, and of course COVID hasn't helped things along, but I think this has been a fascinating first go. And as far as I can tell, and I've been dipping into some of the lectures all day, they've been fascinating. I'm sure it will inspire people to come and join us when we do it for real next year. I know that this plan was hatched about 18 months ago, and I would like to thank Tom as well. I know has been very instrumental in terms of the technology, so thank you so much for that. I know there've also been lots of foot soldiers in and around St. David's. Chris and Ellie, Becky Lloyd and Mike Chant doing a huge amount of work just to make sure local people know about it. I ni yma eleni yn wneud y broses yma yn rhithiol, ond gobeithio blwyddyn nesaf by ni yn gallu gweld yn gilydd ac yn rhannu y profiad yn y cnawd. I know that this year, all of our speakers have been very kind and have made their contributions without any expectation of a fee, and we're very, very grateful for that. But any donations would be really gratefully received, and I know that you can do that through the website. The theme of the festival was to explore how small communities like St. David's can engage with big questions through bold actions. And I think we've touched on so many of those challenges today, from the way we structure our society, as Paul Mason was explaining, a response to the care challenge that is obviously becoming a real challenge for all our communities, but in particular, perhaps communities where we have people, young people leaving in such numbers. And I think that's maybe something that we need to consider in future. The challenge of climate change has been very obvious in all of our debates, and the future of farming, Gareth Wyn-Jones and Sarah Bainon, very inspiring. We've explored mental health and what we can do to address that issue, but also the small steps that can change the world, and the spirituality and the constitution. So we've touched on so many things in just a few hours. So imagine what we'll be able to do next year. So it's someone who's got their roots very deep in St. David's soil. I know what a special place it is and what an influence it has, not only on the people who live there, but also very especially on the people who visit. I do hope that next year you will be able to join us in those pubs and hostelries, so that we can really continue the conversation that has been so fascinating, certainly this evening. I'm sure there are opportunities if you are interested to get involved in helping us to develop the festival. There's a website. If you've got any ideas for what we could be exploring, any ideas for speakers, if you can contribute in any other way, then please get in touch. I don't think we've had a year like the one we've just been through for a long, long time. You think about the challenges we've just had to face. We've had communities shut up for months on end. We've had Brexit. We've had the impact of climate change being felt in a real way in our communities, with flooding and all kinds of other issues. We've seen a huge and rapid shift onto these digital platforms, which I think is going to change the way that we interact in future. I think there are lots of questions in terms of, where do we see ourselves now in the middle of all this flux? What are the values that we should be bringing to bear in the middle of this very changing society that we're living through? There's a lot more to discuss, and we'll be discussing that next year. So diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd am ymuno gyda ni yn y gynhadledd yma. Bydd yr Oil yn parhau y flwyddyn nesaf. Diolch yn fawr i'n siaradwyr ni. We're not just going to continue to explore and to ask questions, but the key thing is that we've got to come up with some solutions as well. And there's no reason why those solutions can't start in a very small community like St. David's. So diolch yn fawr iawn i chi, and please join us next year.
I'll start.
We'll start.